The first jolt felt like the sky had cracked open. Coffee splashed against tray tables, oxygen masks trembled in their compartments, and somewhere behind row 12 a child began to cry, the kind of cry that makes every parent's heart stop. If you had been sitting there, thousands of feet above Missouri farmland, would you have frozen? Or would you have searched your soul for something braver than fear? Seat 8A didn't move at first. Ryan sat slumped against the window, a gray travel pillow hanging loose around his thick neck, his arms folded across a chest that looked carved from stone but carried more weight than muscle alone. He was asleep in the heavy, exhausted way only single parents understand, the kind of sleep stolen between responsibilities, between worries about overdue rent and forgotten science projects, between guilt and love. He hadn't meant to fall asleep. He never did. Back home in Dayton, Ohio, 8-year-old Caleb was staying with Ryan's sister for the weekend. It was the first time Ryan had flown anywhere since his wife, Megan, died 2 years earlier in a car accident on an icy road. He still replayed that night sometimes, wondering if he should have insisted she wait until morning. What if he had? Would Caleb still have his mother? Would Ryan still know how to breathe without forcing it? The plane lurched again, harder this time. Gasps rippled through the cabin like a wave. Ryan's eyes opened slowly, disoriented. He blinked at the trembling window, at the thin line of clouds cutting across a pale blue sky. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice, steady but strained, filled the cabin. There had been a medical emergency in the cockpit. The first officer was struggling with a severe reaction and could no longer assist. The autopilot was engaged, but conditions were deteriorating. The captain asked if there were any licensed combat pilots on board. The words seemed to float in the air, suspended between disbelief and desperation. Passengers looked around, some confused, some terrified. A flight attendant moved quickly down the aisle, scanning faces, her professional calm barely masking the urgency in her eyes. She paused beside Ryan, who was now fully awake, his jaw tight, his pulse hammering against his temples. For a moment, he didn't move. You could almost feel the battle inside him. He hadn't touched a fighter jet in years. After leaving the Air Force, after too many deployments and one mission that still visited him in nightmares, he had promised Megan he was done with danger. He had traded cockpits for construction sites, flight suits for steel-toed boots. He had promised his son he would always come home. If you were him, would you stay seated? Would you think of the child waiting for you, the promise you made, the fragile peace you built from grief? Or would you stand? Ryan thought of Caleb's small hands gripping his jacket the morning he left. He thought of the way his son tried to be brave, the way he whispered, "Don't be a hero, Dad. Just come back." The plane dipped suddenly, sharper this time, and a collective scream rose from the back rows. Ryan closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Then he unbuckled his seat belt. He stood up without looking dramatic, without raising his voice. He simply told the flight attendant his name and the years he had flown F-16s out of South Carolina. Her relief was visible, almost painful to watch. She led him toward the cockpit, past rows of frightened faces clinging to hope. Inside, the air felt thinner, charged. The captain looked older than his uniform suggested, sweat beading at his temples as alarms flickered softly on the panels. Ryan slid into the right seat with a familiarity that felt like muscle memory waking from hibernation. It wasn't a fighter jet. It wasn't built for sharp turns or sudden dives. But the language of flight was universal: angles, speed, instinct. Outside, dark clouds were gathering, a storm system forming faster than predicted. The autopilot struggled against turbulence. Ryan's hands hovered over the controls, steady but not immune to doubt. Years away from the cockpit meant rust. Rust meant risk. He thought of Megan's laugh, of how she used to tease him for pretending not to be scared of anything. He thought of Caleb's baseball glove resting by the front door. He adjusted the trim, calculated descent angles in his head, communicated with air traffic control as the captain regained partial focus. The storm rocked them again, a violent shudder that sent overhead bins rattling like loose bones. Passengers prayed in whispers. Some stared out windows as if memorizing the sky. Time blurred into a single, stretched thread. Ryan didn't try to be fearless. He just chose not to let fear win. As they descended toward St. Louis, rain lashed the windshield in thick, blinding sheets. The runway lights shimmered through the storm like distant stars fighting not to go out. Ryan's arms burned from tension. His breath came in measured counts. He remembered a mission years ago over foreign mountains when visibility dropped to almost nothing. He had been younger then, reckless in a way youth sometimes is. Now he wasn't flying for medals or orders. He was flying for strangers. For the crying child in row 12. For the elderly couple holding hands near the exit. For the version of himself who once believed he could not survive loss. The landing gear locked into place with a heavy thud. The final approach felt endless. The plane bucked once more, and for a split second, doubt sliced through him. If this went wrong, Caleb would lose his father the same way Ryan lost Megan Sutton, unfair, permanent. Would you have pulled back? Would you have wished someone else had stood up instead? Ryan leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on the runway. He adjusted the throttle, guided by instinct sharpened by love as much as training. The wheels hit hard but true. The aircraft bounced once, then settled, tires screeching against wet asphalt. Reverse thrust roared, slowing them as the runway rushed beneath like a river finally surrendering to shore. When the plane came to a complete stop, silence filled the cockpit before the storm's distant rumble crept back in. Then, from the cabin, a sound began to rise, not screams, not panic, but applause. It rolled forward like a wave of gratitude breaking against the cockpit door. Ryan sat still, hands resting on his knees. His heart was still racing, but something inside him had shifted. Not pride. Not relief alone. Something softer. He walked back through the aisle slowly. Passengers reached out to touch his arm, to thank him. A young mother held her toddler closer as she whispered gratitude. An elderly man wiped tears openly. The flight attendant who had first approached him squeezed his hand as if words weren't enough. Ryan returned to seat 8A and looked out the rain-streaked window. He wasn't a hero. He was just a father who had once promised to come home. When he finally stepped into the arrivals area hours later, soaked in exhaustion, his phone buzzed with a message from his sister. Caleb had watched the news. He had seen the breaking story about a former combat pilot helping land a commercial flight during an emergency. He had sent a simple voice note. "I'm glad you didn't stay asleep, Dad. I'm proud of you." Ryan listened to it twice, then pressed the phone against his chest. For the first time since Megan's death, he felt something like forgiveness for himself, for surviving, for choosing to stand up even when fear begged him to sit down. Before the story ends, take a moment and tell me in the comments what you would have done in seat 8A. Ryan didn't save the world that day. He saved a plane full of strangers and, in doing so, reminded himself that courage doesn't mean risking everything recklessly. Sometimes it means carrying your pain, your promises, and your love into the storm anyway. And if this story truly touched your heart, please like, share, comment, and subscribe only if it reminded you that even the most exhausted soul can still rise when it matters most.